The Northwest Baltimore Partnership is comprised of anchor institutions in Northwest Baltimore and Baltimore County who work collaboratively to build value in Northwest Baltimore neighborhoods. Over the years, Northwest Baltimore has undergone significant changes, both blossoming and experiencing setbacks amidst the backdrop of the Pimlico Racecourse. The Northwest Baltimore Partnership has embarked on an oral history project to highlight the stories of local residents and neighborhood leaders in Northwest Baltimore. And these are their stories.
So here's a story that will date me. This is unbelievable. But Queensbury Avenue was right off of Belvedere Avenue. And Belvedere Avenue was a couple blocks from Park Heights. On Park Heights at that time, there was an A&P grocery store. This is maybe 4 or 5 blocks from my house. My mother says at that time, when I was a baby, she would put me in the baby carriage, wheel me to the grocery store, and like the other mothers, they left the carriage with their babies in it outside the store while they went in shopping. Amazing. They shopped and came out and the babies were still in the baby carriage. So that was my orientation to the neighborhood.
I was growing up here in the late 60s and early 70s, and we lived in the same house, and I lived there until I went away to college in 1979. I think what made it special was that I think I thought that we lived in the suburbs for a long time. So my grandmother lived downtown off of North Avenue on Pulaski Street, and my aunt lived on Payson Street. So when we visited the rest of my dad's family here in Baltimore, we'd go to the city. They lived in row houses. So when I visited the other family, I thought we were living fat. You know, I had a big yard, we had fruit trees, we had apple and pear trees, we had strawberries for a while. I could hang out with kids in their yards, and, it just seemed like we had a lot of freedom. And it wasn't really until I went to Roland Park Country School in the Roland Park neighborhood when I was in 7th grade that I realized, there are really well-off people in this town, and we are not those people.
I was raised in Charleston, West Virginia. I came to Baltimore to go to Goucher College, and I met my future husband there. We were married in 1948, and I moved to Baltimore. We lived in Mount Washington. Mount Washington was an old community that originally had been a summer resort for people who lived downtown in Baltimore. The train ran from downtown out to Mount Washington.
My current neighborhood in Northwest Baltimore is Mount Washington. The history is that the Mount Washington Improvement Association has been looking at it and found that it was a neighborhood that had racial covenants. And it was a neighborhood that the Mount Washington Improvement Association is now trying to do some looking at in terms of seeing what were the barriers and what are the current barriers that prohibit true equality and equity within the neighborhood.
People in Mount Washington were very friendly, some more so than others. And as I said, there was some mixing between Jewish people and non-Jewish people. There was some anti-Semitism. We had a neighbor who was not Jewish, and while she was, you might say she was anti-Semitic based on some of her things that she did to us, on the other hand, she taught at the Beis Yaakov school. We always thought that was something of an enigma.
I moved here in late 60s. My whole family moved here, my mother, my father, my sisters, and my brother. We had met the community. I thought we had arrived to somewhere big. When you come from a little teeny child, and this neighborhood just was so big to me, I was just so excited to be moving in a house with my family, with a backyard and a front yard and a porch. It was just so exciting for us.
My parents were born in Baltimore. They lived in the eastern part of Baltimore City on East Baltimore Street. They grew up with family, a lot of people living in the same neighborhood and buildings. They moved all the way out to Ashburton, basically to get into a more suburban lifestyle, an individual family home. Our family was growing, and we were able to take advantage of more space.
So, in many ways, I feel like Ben and I mirror each other growing up. It's really sometimes unbelievable that we do. My parents were born in Baltimore. My grandparents mirrored Ben's, who came over from Eastern Europe, and they lived around the lake, the reservoir. Again, just like Ben, we lived with aunts and uncles around us, and that is my same memory of always being with family, always. On Friday night Shabbat, all day Saturday. My grandparents kept the Sabbath, Shabbat, and their friends and family came to visit them at our house, which I loved. It was a wonderful way to grow up.
The people have always been friendly in this neighborhood, but I moved here, I guess it's been about 44 years ago. And the people here were largely African American and Orthodox Jews. And we've had an influx over the years of a large population of Hispanic people who started coming here maybe 15 years ago. When I first moved here, the neighborhood, and especially the street that I live on, was largely Jewish. And so I learned a lot about their culture, everything from what they do on a day-to-day basis to, unfortunately, what they do when they die. Experienced a full life. And now I'm beginning to learn a lot more about the Hispanic community. So it's changed some, but it's constantly something new to learn.
When I got married, I moved in Liberty Heights area, Milford Avenue, and the same thing happened again. It was an integrated situation. There were maybe 4 blacks, the rest were Jews, and before we knew it, I would say before you could blink your eyes, the Jews had exited, and we became a black neighborhood. My experience in the 1950s were we couldn't go to the restaurants and eat. We couldn't go to the movie theaters. If you went into the stores, you couldn't try on the clothes. And we didn't have the experience of attending the entertainment that went on into the city for black people. And you didn't feel left out because we had our own projects to do. We roller skated. Many of us who lived in a project did not have a car. You couldn't have a car. So we learned to walk, we learned to skate, and we learned to go places, go out to Druid Hill Park. Even when we went to the park, it was segregated. The swimming pools were different. They did not let the blacks in. Then they made provisions for the blacks to have swimming. But we were sort of isolated. That's how the schools were. You went to school in your neighborhood. At that time, our schools didn't even have cafeterias. You had to go home for lunch and come back.
In the late 1940s, Rabbi Morris Lieberman moved from being the assistant rabbi of the congregation to the senior rabbi of the congregation. And Rabbi Lieberman got involved in the civil rights movement, not only because he understood the discrimination Jews were facing, but he understood the greater discrimination that the black community was facing. He never took any of these steps alone. He did them in coalition, especially with ministers within the community, white ministers, but black ministers as well. And the core effort within the civil rights movement as we came into the 1960s in Baltimore was focused on the integration of Gwynn Oak Park. On July 4th, 1963, symbolically chosen for Independence Day, Rabbi Lieberman and another number of other clergy and some others were arrested as they peacefully protested, calling on the owners of Gwynn Oak Park to integrate the park.
So, when I was growing up, in our neighborhood, you were Jewish or you were black. Jewish people had the history of not being allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. Sinai Hospital was founded because Jewish patients were not allowed to go to allowed to go to Hopkins, and Jewish doctors were not allowed to go to medical school there or allowed to admit their patients there. So they started Sinai Hospital so that they would have a place to bring their Jewish patients. So that's in our history and that's in our experience. And I grew up, everyone I knew was either Jewish or black, and I never met a person who was white and not Jewish until I went to college out of state. That's a unique way to experience the world, and that's one of the reasons that we're close as communities, and we live closely together as communities, and our experience of prejudice and oppression, while very different in its expression, still rings true to us and creates understandings that I think inform our relationships currently.
Both sides of my family migrated to Baltimore from the rural South. My grandmother and grandfather, my mom's parents, moved from rural Virginia outside Richmond. My uncles and my aunts and my dad moved from rural North Carolina where my grandfather's parents ran a farm, and they moved. They all ended up in Park Heights, actually. My mom and dad met at the fence at my grandmother's house on Loyal Northway, and the rest is history. What they tell me, and what my grandmother told me before her passing last year, is that they moved into a neighborhood that was tree-lined, where people left their doors open, where they would see people like Earl Monroe from the Bullets visiting to the neighborhood, where everyone was working either at Bethlehem Steel or GM like my grandfather, or Sears like my grandmother, and there were strong families, both black, white, Jewish there. But of course, I don't remember that. I remember a different Park Heights, the one that I spoke about, where we're talking about the drugs and the violence in every corner from Park Circle to Northern Parkway was a different drug shop. And today, we can see that the progress is coming back. And it's really about helping Park Heights, to me, become not just what my grandparents experienced, because we know that it was such a segregated neighborhood, a red line neighborhood even then, but helping it be the best version of Park Heights that it ever has been.
Growing up in Park Heights, there was a huge sense of pride in the community. You were happy to be from Park Heights, and I think as time went on, back when you got into the 90s, 2000s, you started seeing some of the deterioration of the fiber of the neighborhood. We started losing people. We started losing key people. We started losing community leaders. People then began to move further out of the city, further out of the neighborhood, into Baltimore County, surrounding counties, surrounding jurisdictions, and Park Heights began to be a very violent place, particularly in the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was south of Cold Spring Lane. It began to be a violent place. As I said, we were number one in a lot of negative categories: HIV, AIDS, drugs, infant mortality, all of those things. So we were number one in a lot of negative categories, and there had to come about some change. And so the conversations had always been had over the last 20, 30 years of how do we get change and what does it look like?
Well, the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in Park Heights in Northwest Baltimore was not a rosy time. I was born and raised in the middle of the drug crisis and epidemic in Baltimore and in the United States. I had to live through all of that, had to live through the violence that came out of that in the 90s, more so than any time, but really in the 90s, had to live through what we call either over-policing or under-policing, never the right amount of community-based policing. So imagine living in that time in the 80s and 90s, 2000s, where I could just be outside playing basketball with my friends and on a church lot right behind our house that's still there today behind St. John's, that's on Pimlico Road in Cold Spring, where we would have to jump into the bushes and duck bullets. And then the next day we'll be out there playing basketball and we all be sat down on the concrete in handcuffs just because we were out there.
When I was living in Pennsylvania, and I would come back and visit my parents and family on holidays, driving down Cold Spring and looking at Park Heights, looking at Ricestown Road, it was devastating. I would literally cry when I would see the buildings, the deterioration, just how unsafe it was for our young people, for anybody, to walk those streets. And then I would talk to my parents, what happened? And they seemed like they didn't even know how it could have gotten that bad. And so after my children became adults, and I decided, well, I'm coming back to Baltimore. My background is in community economic development, where I work with cities throughout Pennsylvania. And I said, I'm going to use what my skills are and help my community. And so I reached out, and I would go to the meetings that the city would have. I still didn't see anything happening for the children. My son, who came to Baltimore with me from Pennsylvania, my youngest son, was killed here. He was beat to death by a mentally ill man. My son was a volunteer, what you might call a street volunteer. He would go to homeless youth and try and get them services. And one guy, he was mentally ill, and I don't know the details of it, but that just pushed me more that we had to do better. I have a large percentage of my young people whose parents are either incarcerated or have drug and mental health problems. And the best our youth can get in terms of role models is when they come to the center. And we bring all types of people in who have been able to make it through some of the same issues our children are dealing with, and they come and they're entrepreneurs or they have their own nonprofit organizations. So we are going to do our best.
Most of the change that I see in my community has come within the last 20 years or so. For a while, it didn't seem to change. It was delightful living here. More recently, we see, I guess, what every other neighborhood in Baltimore City sees. We see an uptick in crime, unfortunately. And we also see some of the, I guess, houses are not as in good shape as they used to be. The plaza, which is up the street, as I said before, has changed a lot. All the stores that we loved back then are gone. And more recently, some additional stores moved out. So it's changed in that regard. The people are still friendly, and that really is what makes a neighborhood. I have neighbors who I've had for the full 44 years that I've been here, and it's wonderful to know that we know those people, and they know me, and they're going to look out for me, and I'm going to look out for them.
As mayor, what I would like to see for Northwest Baltimore is, for us to be one Northwest Baltimore. We have to come together as people to see all of us who live, who love, who come from Northwest Baltimore really as equal, and understand that we're only going to survive but really thrive in our area if we all are working together. 2, We have to follow through and stay committed to the plans to redevelop and reimagine Northwest Baltimore.
This neighborhood is exactly that. It's a neighborhood. It's where people live. It's where people are devoted. Your sense of yourself is partly influenced by your sense of place. And every time I drive by Northwestern High School, which isn't even Northwestern High School anymore, my memories are flooded with my life as a teenager.
I lived between Northwest Baltimore and Pikesville from between 1992 until I went to college in 2001, and then I was back and forth. You know, there's a lot of segregation that exists, and especially the community that I grew up in, the white Jewish community. I think that sometimes there's a real sort of like, people are scared of interacting with people who are not like themselves, and I think that that's also a real trend that exists in Northwest Baltimore that I don't think is positive. But I do think it's special that there are lots of unique cultures that exist up here, and people can maintain those cultural traditions.
The hope is that we turn the community around and we go back to doing some things, but we're being very different going forward, that we do things that hopefully there's a sense of collective ideas that are being put forth, and young people are involved in that process, that they're learning from the seniors, that we're doing development, that we're doing affordable housing, and that the people that's doing the work in our neighborhoods and our communities are the people that live there, that the young people that we see standing outside, that they're doing this very work that people are saying that needs to be done, that we're encouraging everybody to be a part of the process and not be a part of the problem and not complain about it.
We want our young people who are deciding where to put their roots down for their family to choose Baltimore. But for that to happen, Baltimore needs to be safe, needs to have an economic opportunity for employment, and needs to have a quality of life that urban centers are really noted for. So we have to invest in making sure Baltimore stays strong, that it has the types of facilities that people want in their community, and we have safety as a primary factor. And then we also want people who are getting older to feel comfortable to remain in Baltimore, knowing that the community will support them and that they're welcomed in the community. I think that's Baltimore's future. I think that's urban center's future. Baltimore is a great urban center. It's had a great history, and we believe it has a great future.
This area and its diversity is so unique that it reminds me of the United States itself. In a small package, we have Orthodox Jewish community, we have the African American community, we have Haitians and Jamaicans, we have Latino. This community is so diverse that we are the snapshot of what our new nation wants to look like. We're working with the LGBTQ community. We're working with all those that identify with whatever you want to identify with. Whether your religion or your sexual orientation, we learn to love each other as a family and work towards a common goal, that it's a place that we can reflect and raise our children and be prosperous in what we do here.
Diverse neighborhoods need to work together. That's one of the very important, essential things that I do as a legislator, is try to work with the diverse communities that I represent throughout Northwest and West Baltimore. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the issues before us in 2021 is the future of Pimlico Junior High, the Police Training Academy site. And that is an issue. The resolution of that issue has to be done in a way that is acceptable to both the Jewish community and the Black community. And the only way that's going to happen is if both communities are around a table, talking through the issue, trying to find positive uses for that site.
I know people often say we can't go backwards, but we are going forward. We are advancing, and as we move forward into the future, as we advance into the future, I would like to see, the development, real, what I call real development.
Where we're really trying to bring people together to talk about those differences and be frank about some of the challenges, some of the biases, and really understanding those cultural differences so that we can pave the way forward.
We need to tell our story. We need to be honest. It's okay. Yes, it hurt, but this is what getting over it takes. You got to take a chance. You got to step out there and give it a try and tell your story. It's okay.
The Northwest Baltimore Partnership Oral History Project is building a tool that will create a collection of living people's testimony about their own and their families' experiences while recognizing individuals' unique historical importance, particularly in Northwest Baltimore. The goal of this project is to foster collaboration, cultivate cross-cultural conversations, and encourage intergenerational learning within the Northwest Baltimore community, all while catalyzing community change through relationships.